Lena adjusted the strap of her medic bag and glanced at the clock on the kitchen wall. 5 minutes until Ivy would burst through the door, rattling off a dozen facts she had learned that day. It was their routine, Lena finishing her shift, just in time to greet Ivy after school, before they shared stories over an early dinner. Right on cue, the front door swung open, and Ivy flew inside, her backpack half unzipped, her jacket hanging off one shoulder. "Mom. Guess what we're doing in science?" Lena pulled a carton of milk from the fridge and set it on the counter. "Tell me." Ivy pulled out a crumpled flyer from her bag, her curls bouncing as she hopped in place. "It's a DNA project. We're gonna learn about ancestry and traits and all that cool stuff." She waved the paper in the air. "Look. They're sending our samples to a real lab, and we'll get a report with all our genetic history. Can we do it? Please?" Lena wiped her hands on her scrub pants and took the paper, scanning it quickly. It looked harmless enough. A school-sanctioned program, partnering with some educational science initiative. Swabs and saliva, she mused. No blood involved? Ew, no. Ivy made a face. Just a cheek swab. Lena hesitated only a moment before nodding. Ivy had been fascinated with science lately, and if this kept her engaged, why not? "All right," she said, tossing the flyer on the counter. "We'll do it." Ivy squealed and grabbed the envelope containing the kit from her bag. "I already have everything. I just need your signature. And we both have to do it so I can compare my genes to yours. That's the whole point." Lena chuckled at her daughter's enthusiasm. "Fine, fine." She signed the permission form, and they sat at the kitchen table, swabbing the insides of their cheeks before sealing the samples in the provided envelopes. Ivy's hands worked quickly, stuffing everything back into the package. "This is so cool," she said, grinning as she carefully packed up their samples. "I can't wait to see what it says." Lena ruffled her daughter's curls. "I hope it tells you why you refuse to eat tomatoes even though they're perfectly delicious." Ivy gasped. "Maybe it's genetic." She grabbed the envelope and ran to her backpack. "I'll give it to Ms. Dorsey tomorrow." A few weeks passed, and the project faded to the back of Lena's mind, lost between long shifts and the usual chaos of single motherhood. Until the school event. It was one of those well-meaning community nights, parents crammed into the gymnasium, balancing paper plates of store-bought cookies while the school principal droned on about budget concerns. Lena stood in a cluster of parents, nodding along to small talk while keeping an eye on Ivy, who was across the room with her friends, pointing at some science project display. As she reached for her phone, a notification popped up. "Your DNA report is ready." She clicked the link, mildly curious. Ivy had probably already checked hers, but Lena figured it wouldn't hurt to take a quick glance. A moment later, the report loaded, full of colorful graphs and ancestry percentages. European heritage, Scandinavian influences, nothing surprising. Then, out of habit, she scrolled to the familial matches section. And froze. Ivy's name was there, listed as her daughter, just as expected. But beneath that, under paternal match, was a name Lena didn't recognize. Her breath caught in her throat. There had to be a mistake. She tapped the name, her fingers numb. The system confirmed it, a 99.99% paternal match. Not Ethan. Not the man she had loved and lost, the man she had mourned when their relationship ended, the man she had told Ivy stories about. Lena's hands trembled as she reread the result, her vision blurring. This wasn't possible. There was no one else. The air in the gym suddenly felt too thick, the fluorescent lights too bright. The conversations around her faded into white noise. Someone bumped into her, and she barely registered it. This had to be a mistake. But the numbers didn't lie. Lena barely remembered how she got home from the school event. The whole drive was a blur of taillights and honking horns, her hands gripping the wheel too tightly, her stomach twisting itself into impossible knots. As soon as she stepped inside, she dug her phone out of her bag and called the school. It was late, but the automated system patched her through to the after-hours voicemail. That wasn't going to work. She pulled up the email from the genetic testing service and scanned for a contact number. A customer service line. She dialed, pacing the length of her small kitchen, her socks catching on the scuffed linoleum. After 2 rings, a bright voice answered. "Thank you for calling Gen X. How can I assist you today?" Lena pressed a hand to her forehead. "There's been a mistake. I submitted a DNA sample through my daughter's school project, and the results are wrong. It's saying her biological father isn't who I know he is." There was a pause. "I understand how this can be surprising," the woman said, her tone softening. "But I assure you, our results are 99.99% accurate. Errors are extremely rare." Lena's fingers tightened around the phone. "Then this is one of those rare times." The woman hesitated. "Would you like me to review the sample details for confirmation?" "Yes," Lena said immediately. She listened to the sound of clicking keys, her pulse hammering in her ears. Somewhere in the apartment, she heard Ivy humming to herself, completely unaware of the storm brewing in her mother's mind. "Ms. Whitmore," the woman said finally, "I'm looking at your submission now, and everything appears in order. There was no mix-up in processing. The results you received are correct." Lena's stomach dropped. "That's not possible. I understand how difficult this must be." The woman's voice was gentle, but firm. "If you'd like, you can submit another test for verification, but I want to prepare you for the likelihood that the results will remain the same." Lena barely managed to thank her before hanging up. The phone slipped from her fingers onto the counter. This wasn't happening. There had to be some other explanation. She needed to call Ethan. Her hands shook as she scrolled through her contacts, landing on a name she hadn't dialed in years. Ethan Prescott. The man she had loved. The man she had grieved. The man she had believed, with absolute certainty, was Ivy's father. The line rang twice before a groggy voice answered. "Lena?" She exhaled sharply. "I know it's late. I wouldn't call if it wasn't important." Ethan cleared his throat, waking up fully. "What's wrong? Is Ivy okay?" "She's fine," Lena said quickly. "It's not her. It's something else." A beat of silence. "Okay." She gripped the phone with both hands. "Do you remember when I got pregnant?" He let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah, Lena. I remember. There's something wrong with the DNA test from Ivy's school." She swallowed hard. "It says you're not her father." Silence. "Then, that's ridiculous." "I know," Lena said, voice strained. "That's what I thought too. But I called the lab. They checked everything. They said it's right." Another silence, longer this time. "Lena," Ethan said slowly, "Ivy is my daughter." She closed her eyes. "Will you take a paternity test?" She heard him sigh on the other end. "You don't actually believe this, do you?" "I don't know what to believe," she admitted. "But I need to be sure." Ethan hesitated. Then, "All right. I'll take the test." A week had never felt so long. Lena functioned on autopilot. She worked her shifts, made Ivy's lunches, checked homework, and answered work calls. But underneath it all, her mind was a mess of questions. The morning the results arrived, she barely managed to open her email without dropping her phone. The words stared back at her, sharp and absolute. Probability of paternity, 0%. Lena's breath left her in a rush. Ethan wasn't Ivy's father. She reread the document, hoping she had misinterpreted it, but the numbers didn't change. The science didn't care what she remembered, what she had believed for nearly a decade. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. She set the phone down on the table and covered her face with both hands, her body cold despite the heat in the apartment. Had she misremembered something? Was there some moment, some detail lost in time that could explain how this was happening? She squeezed her eyes shut, reaching back into the past, to the time before Ivy, before motherhood, before the version of herself that had existed in a completely different world. She had been with Ethan. Only Ethan. Hadn't she? Lena sat at the kitchen table, a stack of old paperwork spread out before her. Bills, appointment reminders, hospital statements, all the forgettable remnants of past years, shoved into a folder she hadn't thought about in ages. Ivy was at a friend's house for a sleepover, leaving Lena alone with her thoughts and the gnawing, relentless question, how had this happened? She had barely slept since the test results arrived. Every time she closed her eyes, her mind replayed the same loop, her relationship with Ethan, the months leading up to Ivy's birth, the certainty that she had never been with anyone else. It wasn't a matter of memory, she knew. And yet, the test told a different story. She exhaled slowly and flipped through another pile of papers, her fingers working automatically. A utility bill. A pediatrician's visit. An old lease agreement. Then something else, smaller, with crisp hospital letterhead paper. Her hands stilled. It was a bill from a fertility clinic. Lena frowned and brought it closer, scanning the name, Westlake Fertility Associates. It was dated nearly a decade ago, a few months before she had gotten pregnant. The amount was small, not a procedure, just a consultation. She barely remembered going. She flipped the paper over, but there were no notes, nothing to explain why it had ended up in this forgotten pile. A hazy memory surfaced, sitting in an office, a white-coated doctor explaining something about irregular cycles. She had gone in on the recommendation of her OB/GYN, just to make sure everything was normal. Blood tests. Maybe an ultrasound. And that was it. She hadn't needed any treatments. She hadn't even been trying to get pregnant at the time. So why did this feel important now? Lena reached for her phone and searched for the clinic's name. A few results popped up, but her stomach twisted when she saw the latest headline. Westlake Fertility Associates shut down amid lawsuit alleging medical fraud. She clicked the article, skimming frantically. Allegations of misconduct. Unethical fertility treatments. Women implanted without consent. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear her own thoughts. The timeline didn't make sense. It didn't make sense because she had never needed fertility treatments. She had only gone in for a consultation. Hadn't she? She dropped the phone onto the table and pressed her palms to her face. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong for a long time, and she was only just beginning to see it. Across the city, Gabriel Knox sat in his penthouse office, skimming the morning's reports when a notification popped up on his laptop. New close relative detected, a daughter. His fingers froze above the keyboard. Gabriel barely remembered signing up for the genealogy website. He had done it years ago, likely after one too many drinks at a tech summit where some overenthusiastic scientist had convinced him to spit into a tube and contribute to the grand mission of genetic mapping. He had never checked the results. But this was impossible. He clicked the notification. There, under the Close Relatives section, was a name he didn't recognize. Ivy Whitmore. 9 years old. He sat back in his chair, staring at the screen, his entire body motionless. He didn't have a daughter. He had never had a child. Had he? Gabriel stared at his computer screen, unmoving. The words on the page didn't change. New close relative detected, a daughter. 9 years old. Ivy Whitmore. He sat back in his chair, his mind working through the possibilities, all of them absurd. A mistake in the database. A security breach. A scam. Gabriel had never fathered a child. He would have known. He clicked deeper into the results, his name appearing in cold, clinical precision under paternal match, 99.99%. Below that, another name. Maternal match, Lena Whitmore. That meant nothing to him. He reached for his phone and dialed his head of legal, his voice measured as always. I need a full background check on someone. Lena Whitmore. He heard the pause on the other end. And the nature of the request? Gabriel's fingers drummed against his desk. Unclear. Let's assume fraud. It wasn't his usual style to chase mysteries. His world revolved around numbers, data, results. But this wasn't something he could ignore. Meanwhile, across town, Lena sat in front of her laptop, clicking through endless dead ends. She had spent hours trying to access her medical records, searching for anything that might explain how her visit to a fertility clinic years ago had led to this. But Westlake Fertility Associates was gone, wiped from existence. The website redirected to a legal statement confirming the clinic had ceased operations following irregularities in patient treatments. She called every number she could find, but they either rang into oblivion or led to vague, useless recordings. Her medical portal had nothing past a few insurance claims. She wasn't sure what terrified her more, the fact that the clinic had vanished or the sinking feeling that she had been part of whatever had gone wrong. Her phone vibrated, breaking her focus. Unknown number. She hesitated before answering. This is Lena. A voice, smooth and controlled, filled the silence. This is Gabriel Knox. I believe we need to talk. Lena stepped into the sleek glass building, her fingers curled into fists at her sides. She had barely slept, her mind a looping reel of worst-case scenarios. When the unknown number had called, she had expected a scammer, a telemarketer, even an old debt collector. What she hadn't expected was a billionaire claiming they needed to talk. Now she stood in the private office of Gabriel Knox, the man who was somehow connected to the most unexplainable thing in her life. The air was crisp with the scent of expensive wood polish and something citrusy she couldn't place. A single wall of windows stretched across the room, revealing the sprawling skyline behind him. And there he was. Gabriel Knox looked exactly like the kind of man who ran biotech empires, perfectly tailored suit, a watch that probably cost more than her apartment, and the controlled, unreadable expression of someone who never let emotions interfere with business. He barely spared her a glance before gesturing toward the chair opposite his desk. Ms. Whitmore. Lena ignored the chair. How do you know my name? Gabriel leaned back slightly, his fingers laced together on the desk. I had you vetted before I called. You, she exhaled sharply. Right. Because it's completely normal to have strangers investigated instead of just saying what you want over the phone. His expression remained unreadable. You already know what this is about. Lena's heartbeat pounded against her ribs, but she refused to let him see an ounce of fear. No, actually, I don't. Because the only reason my name should be in your system is if you were a sperm donor. Something flickered in his gaze, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. I've never donated sperm in my life. She let out a sharp laugh. Well, according to a DNA test, you're my daughter's biological father, so one of us is lying. Gabriel exhaled through his nose, the closest thing to a reaction she had gotten so far. Then explain to me, Ms. Whitmore, how that is possible. That's what I'm trying to figure out, she snapped. All I know is I went to a fertility clinic years ago for some routine tests, and now, suddenly, my daughter's DNA is linked to some rich guy I've never met. So maybe ask yourself how your genetic material ended up in their system. His jaw tensed. I don't deal in speculation. Oh, is that what you don't deal in? Lena crossed her arms, tilting her head. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you deal in a lot of secrets and power plays. Gabriel's gaze sharpened. Careful. Lena let out a dry laugh. What, are you going to sue me for calling you shady? Add it to my growing list of problems. Silence stretched between them, thick and unmoving. Gabriel studied her, and for the first time, she felt like he was really looking, taking in the tension in her shoulders, the exhaustion in her face, the sheer chaos of the last few weeks reflected in her stance. An independent DNA test, he said finally. She blinked. What? We'll take another test. One neither of us controls. If the results come back the same, we move forward from there. Lena swallowed, the weight of everything pressing down on her. It wasn't a bad idea. At least then she would know, without a shadow of a doubt, that there was no mistake. She nodded. Fine. A week later, Lena sat in her kitchen, staring at the email. Test results available. Her fingers trembled as she clicked. Gabriel Knox. 99.99% probability of paternity. Her stomach turned. The room felt too small, the walls pressing in. It was real. Ivy wasn't Ethan's. She was his. Lena dropped her head into her hands as her world came apart at the seams. Across the city, Gabriel Knox read the results in silence. He didn't move, didn't react, didn't breathe for a full 30 seconds. Then, slowly, something flickered in his eyes. Gabriel sat at his desk, his fingers motionless on the keyboard. The DNA results were still open on his screen, stark and undeniable. 99.99% probability of paternity. He was Ivy Whitmore's biological father. A child he hadn't known existed. A child he had never conceived. There was no logical explanation. Gabriel Knox didn't make mistakes. His life ran on efficiency, structure, and absolute control. He had built his empire by eliminating risk, predicting every possible outcome before it happened. And yet, somehow, his DNA had created a daughter without his knowledge. A headache pulsed behind his eyes as he pulled up his private medical files. He hadn't been to a fertility clinic. That much he was sure of. But there had been that one visit. He scrolled through old records until he found it. Westlake Fertility Associates, October 2012. A consultation, a routine screening, recommended after a minor health scare. He had gone in for precautionary tests, nothing more. No sperm donation. No long-term treatments. Just a standard genetic analysis and blood work to confirm everything was functioning as expected. Westlake Fertility Associates. His stomach tightened. The name was familiar now, not just from his own past, but from something else, something recent. Lena Whitmore had visited the same clinic. He exhaled through his nose, controlled and steady, the way he did when staring down an acquisition deal about to go sideways. His mind worked through the implications as he reached for his phone. Lena answered on the third ring. What? No greeting. No hesitation. He might have been amused under different circumstances. I need to see you, he said. A pause. Then, of course you do. Lena sat across from Gabriel in a private conference room, her arms crossed over her chest, her knee bouncing under the table. She was still dressed in her paramedic uniform, dark blue with faint scuff marks on the sleeves. It didn't suit the pristine glass and steel surroundings of Knox Biotech, but then again, neither did she. So, she prompted. What's the next round of damage control? Gabriel slid a file across the table. I visited Westlake Fertility Associates in 2012. Lena frowned but opened the folder, scanning the medical notes. Her expression shifted from guarded to something closer to disbelief. You went there? A single visit, he said. Blood work. Genetic testing. She flipped through the pages, skimming the details. That's the same year I went. A few months before I got pregnant. Gabriel leaned forward slightly. I never donated sperm. Lena snapped the folder shut. Neither did I ask for an embryo transfer. Silence filled the space between them, heavy with the weight of a puzzle that neither of them had all the pieces for. Lena dragged a hand through her hair. You think they stole your DNA? Gabriel's jaw tightened. I think we were both victims of something. She shook her head, letting out a short, humorless laugh. Fantastic. That makes me feel so much better. Gabriel ignored the sarcasm. The clinic was shut down under suspicion of unethical medical practices. I saw the articles, Lena muttered. No one really dug into the details, though. It's all vague, lawsuits that never went anywhere, patient complaints that just got swept under the rug. Patients who likely never even knew what happened to them, Gabriel said. Lena rubbed her temples. So let me get this straight. You walk into a clinic for some test, I go in for a checkup months later, and somehow, I end up pregnant with your child? Gabriel met her gaze, unflinching. That's what it looks like. Lena sat back, exhaling through her nose. This is insane. Gabriel's voice was even. And yet, here we are. Lena shook her head, frustration simmering just beneath the surface. Why us? What would they even get out of this? Gabriel had already considered every possible angle. The clinic specialized in fertility solutions. If they were experimenting with unauthorized genetic transfers, they would need viable samples from high-quality donors. She made a face. Did you just call yourself a high-quality donor? He didn't flinch. I have a rare genetic profile. High IQ markers. No hereditary diseases. If they were selecting embryos for viability, I would have been an ideal candidate. Lena let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Great. So you're saying my pregnancy was some kind of science project? Gabriel didn't answer. Lena pushed back from the table and started pacing, her boots clicking against the polished floor. This is absolutely unhinged. Gabriel watched her, calculating. We need more information. She stopped pacing. Oh, do we? Because I think the information is pretty clear. Some creepy, unethical doctors decided to play God, and I got caught in the middle of it. That's not enough. She narrowed her eyes. Enough for what? For legal action. For proof. Lena let out a slow breath, crossing her arms. You want to investigate? Gabriel leaned forward. I don't want to. I will. She stared at him for a long moment, then shook her head. I don't trust you. I don't expect you to. Lena bit the inside of her cheek. Every part of her wanted to walk out of that room and never look back. To pretend none of this was happening. But pretending wouldn't change the fact that her daughter's existence was wrapped up in a mystery neither of them understood. She sighed and ran a hand through her hair. Fine. I'm in. Gabriel gave a short nod. Then we start now. Gabriel sat at the head of a long conference table, his laptop open in front of him, a collection of files and reports stacked neatly to his right. Across from him, Lena sat with her arms crossed, her expression a mix of exhaustion and irritation. She had been in his office for less than 5 minutes and already looked like she regretted every decision that had led her here. He didn't blame her. He felt the same way. One of his top investigators, a sharp-eyed man named Clark, stood beside a large screen, flipping through slides. Each one contained records from Westlake Fertility Associates, the clinic where both Gabriel and Lena had, unknowingly, become part of something much bigger than themselves. Clark cleared his throat. The clinic was shut down after multiple allegations of unethical fertility practices. Lawsuits were filed, but nothing ever stuck. Patients who had undergone treatments started reporting inconsistencies, wrong paternity results, unexpected pregnancies, fertility procedures they never agreed to. Most cases were dismissed for lack of concrete evidence, and the clinic managed to evade full-scale legal consequences before shutting down completely. Lena leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table. How does this happen? How does a medical facility just accidentally implant people with the wrong embryos? Clark hesitated. Gabriel had read the reports already. The answer wasn't accidental at all. They weren't just a fertility clinic, Gabriel said, his voice even. They were running unauthorized genetic experiments. Lena stared at him. What does that even mean? Clark clicked to the next slide. They selected high-quality genetic donors. People with desirable markers, intelligence, health, genetic diversity. Then, without consent, they used those samples to implant embryos into women who had come in for unrelated treatments. Lena let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. No. No. I didn't get an embryo transfer. I went in for routine testing. Blood work. That's it. Clark didn't react. He clicked to another slide. Your name is on their internal records under Selective Patient Trial Candidates. Gabriel watched as Lena's face shifted, her certainty cracking. You were implanted without your knowledge, Gabriel said. She blinked at him. You're saying I walked into a doctor's office, had some blood drawn, and walked out pregnant? Clark nodded grimly. It appears so. Lena let out a short, disbelieving laugh. That's insane. Insane, yes, Gabriel said. But not impossible. Lena pressed a hand to her forehead. This isn't real. This can't be real. Gabriel slid another document across the table. It's real. She glanced down. It was her patient file. The one she had spent weeks trying to access, buried under layers of legal roadblocks. Her signature was at the bottom of a form, except she had never signed it. Lena's breath came out in a shaky exhale. This is forged. Gabriel nodded. That's why none of this ever came to light. They falsified records, manipulated legal loopholes, and ensured that if anyone did start asking questions, there was no easy way to prove what had happened. Lena pushed the file away like it burned. And you? How did they get your DNA? Gabriel clenched his jaw. The same way. I went in for genetic screening. Standard health assessment. They stole my sample. Lena let out a slow breath and sank back into her chair. Gabriel waited for her to speak, but she didn't. She was staring down at the table, her hands clenched together, her entire body wound tight. He understood. He had felt it too, when he read the report, this deep, unshakable violation. For years, he had controlled every aspect of his life, his business, his reputation. And yet, without his knowledge, a piece of him had been taken and used to create a child he had never known existed. Lena finally lifted her head, her expression blank but her voice low and unsteady. So what are we supposed to do with this? Gabriel had no answer. They sat in silence. Lena sat on her couch, staring at nothing. The apartment was quiet, the kind of oppressive silence that made her skin crawl. Ivy had fallen asleep an hour ago, curled into a ball under her favorite blanket, unaware that her entire existence had just been rewritten. Lena pressed the heels of her palms against her eyes, but the tears wouldn't come. She had cried enough in the past few days. Now, all that was left was a dull, pulsing ache in her chest. Ivy was still hers. That was the thought she kept clinging to. No amount of paperwork, no twisted experiment, no billionaire with a team of lawyers could change the fact that she had carried Ivy for 9 months, rocked her to sleep at night, kissed scraped knees and calmed nightmares. But knowing that didn't erase the violation. Someone had taken her body and used it without her consent. Someone had stolen a child from a man who never agreed to be a father. Someone had played with lives like they were nothing more than data points on a spreadsheet. And no matter how much she hated it, that someone had made Ivy exist. She let out a slow breath and leaned forward, elbows on her knees. Legal action had already started. Gabriel had pulled every string possible, assembling a team of investigators, forensic analysts, and medical experts. Lena had been roped into it by default, her name attached to every case file, every press inquiry, every deposition. But it didn't matter. Westlake Fertility Associates was gone. The doctors had vanished, the records were missing, and the lawsuits would take years to move through the system. Even if justice was served, it wouldn't change the one thing Lena needed it to. Ivy was Gabriel Knox's biological daughter. And he wanted to be involved. The thought made her stomach turn. She had made that clear, she wanted nothing to do with him. She had spent 9 years raising Ivy alone, sacrificing sleep and sanity, patching together a life that worked for the two of them. Gabriel had walked into this mess with his endless resources and his unreadable expression, but he hadn't been there when Ivy had a fever in the middle of the night or when she cried over a lost toy. Gabriel didn't know Ivy. And yet, in that cold, clinical way of his, he had told Lena exactly what he intended to do. "She's my daughter," he had said. "I will be part of her life." Like it was a contract he could enforce, a deal that had already been signed. Lena had walked out of his office without another word. But then Ivy started asking questions. At first, it was small things. "Mom, do we have any family besides Grandma? What does DNA even do? Is it possible for someone to have 2 dads?" Lena had tried to keep her answers vague, redirecting whenever possible. But Ivy was too smart for that. Then, one night, Ivy had crawled onto the couch beside her, pulling her knees to her chest, and asked the question Lena had been dreading. "Mom, do I have a dad?" Lena's throat had gone dry. She had rehearsed versions of this conversation before, imagined different ways it might play out. But nothing had prepared her for the way Ivy looked at her in that moment, curious, but cautious, like she already sensed there was something Lena hadn't told her. Lena had swallowed hard, brushing Ivy's curls back from her face. "Of course you do, sweetheart. Everyone has a dad." Ivy had considered that. "Then where is he?" Lena's stomach had twisted. She could have lied. Could have said what she always did, "Ethan isn't here, but he loved you very much." But Ethan wasn't Ivy's father. Gabriel was. And Ivy deserved the truth. Lena adjusted the silverware on the small cafe table for the 3rd time, her fingers tense around the napkin. Across from her, Ivy sipped her chocolate milk through a straw, swinging her legs under the chair. Completely at ease. Completely unaware that her world was about to tilt. Gabriel wasn't late. That wasn't something a man like him did. But Lena still found herself checking the time, half hoping he would cancel, disappear into whatever billionaire void he had crawled out of. Then the door swung open. Gabriel Knox, all 6 feet of carefully contained power, stepped inside. He was overdressed for the cafe, his black coat sharp against the soft, lived-in atmosphere. His gaze scanned the room until it landed on Lena. She cleared her throat and nudged Ivy's arm. "Sweetheart, this is..." Gabriel pulled out the chair across from Ivy and sat before Lena could finish the sentence. "I'm Gabriel," he said. Ivy blinked up at him, taking another slow sip of her chocolate milk before nodding. "Hi." Lena shot Gabriel a look. This was not how they had agreed to play it. She had spent the morning preparing a script, practicing ways to make this introduction as harmless as possible. Mom's old friend. Just someone stopping by to say hello. But Gabriel, as usual, had no patience for unnecessary words. Ivy tilted her head. "You're kinda serious looking." Gabriel's fingers tightened around his glass of water. "Am I?" "Yeah," she said, squinting. "Like a guy in a spy movie." Lena covered her mouth to keep from laughing. Gabriel, on the other hand, looked like he had never been compared to a fictional secret agent before. "I don't work in espionage," he said finally. Ivy tapped her straw against the edge of her cup. That's exactly what a spy would say. Lena watched as something unfamiliar crossed Gabriel's face. Uncertainty. Ivy turned to her. How do you know him? Lena kept her smile easy, casual. Oh, we knew each other a long time ago. Ivy studied Gabriel for another moment. You don't look like one of Mom's old friends. Lena's breath caught. Gabriel tilted his head. What do I look like? Ivy shrugged. I don't know. You kinda look like me. The words hung between them, heavy and unshakable. Gabriel didn't move, but Lena could feel the shift in him. The realization, the weight of it settling into his posture, into the way his expression softened just slightly. Ivy had said it so simply, so matter-of-factly. As if it was just another observation, like noting the color of his coat or the way he sat up too straight. Gabriel didn't answer her. But Lena saw the way his grip loosened on the glass. The way his shoulders eased. Ivy turned back to her drink, oblivious to the way she had just rearranged the air around them. Lena stood in her kitchen, arms crossed, watching Gabriel pace like an expensive, well-dressed storm cloud. He hadn't even taken off his coat, and she wasn't sure if it was because he didn't plan on staying long or because he needed it to shield himself from the absolute chaos of her apartment. Ivy's schoolwork was spread out on the counter, a half-eaten peanut butter sandwich sat abandoned on the table, and somewhere in the background, an animated movie played at low volume. It wasn't pristine, but it was home. And Gabriel looked like he wanted to burn it all to the ground and build something better. We need to discuss Ivy's education, he said, voice clipped. Lena raised an eyebrow. Do we? She's gifted, he continued, ignoring the challenge in her tone. She should be in an environment that nurtures that. Lena exhaled slowly. She knew this conversation was coming, had seen it the moment Ivy had looked at Gabriel across the cafe and said, "You kinda look like me." But she had hoped for at least a few weeks of neutrality before they ended up here. She's already in a good school, Lena said. Gabriel's expression didn't change, but she could feel the argument building in him like an incoming storm. She's in a public school with an outdated curriculum and overcrowded classrooms. She's happy there. She doesn't know what she's missing. Lena pushed away from the counter, planting her hands on her hips. Oh, and you do? I do, he said simply. I can offer her access to the best schools in the country. Private instructors. The kind of education that would set her up for life. Lena let out a short, humorless laugh. You met her once, Gabriel. One time. And now you think you know what's best for her? Gabriel's jaw tightened. I know what it's like to grow up without options. Lena scoffed. Right, because being a billionaire's daughter is the only way to have a decent life. That's not what I'm saying. Then what are you saying? Gabriel's eyes darkened. That I refuse to sit back and watch my daughter settle for less than what she deserves. Lena's stomach twisted. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said my daughter, like he had a claim now, like he had just been waiting to stake his flag. She doesn't need things, Lena snapped. She needs stability. She needs people who love her. She needs to be a kid. She can have all of that and more. Lena shook her head. You think throwing money at something makes it better? Gabriel exhaled, slow and measured, like he was trying to reel himself back in. I think giving her the best possible opportunities is what a parent is supposed to do. Lena felt something hot rise in her chest. Oh, now you're a parent? Something flickered in his gaze, just for a second. Lena swallowed hard, willing herself to stay calm. You don't get to show up and decide everything changes. Gabriel was silent for a long moment. Then, quietly, he said, I'm not going anywhere. Lena clenched her jaw, every part of her bracing for the battle that was just beginning. Ivy sat on the floor of her room, flipping through a book she had already read twice, trying to tune out the conversation happening in the kitchen. Or rather, the argument. She wasn't supposed to be listening. Her mom had a rule about eavesdropping, something about privacy and respect, but Ivy wasn't exactly trying to hear them. It wasn't her fault that their voices were loud enough to carry down the short hallway of their tiny apartment. She turned a page, pretending to focus, but the sharp edge in her mother's voice made her grip the book tighter. You don't get to walk in and start making decisions. I'm not making decisions, I'm presenting options, Gabriel said, his voice calm but firm, the way people talked when they were trying very hard not to yell. Options that I never asked for. She deserves more. She has everything she needs. There was a beat of silence, then Gabriel spoke again, quieter this time. She deserves the truth. Ivy frowned. She knew they were talking about her. They had been doing that a lot lately, in hushed tones that stopped when she walked into the room, in glances that didn't make sense. She wasn't stupid. There was something about Gabriel that her mom wasn't telling her. She turned another page without reading it, her stomach twisting. The next afternoon, Gabriel picked her up from school. That was new. Usually, it was her mom or, on rare occasions, their neighbor Mrs. Green, who smelled like vanilla candles and let Ivy eat as many cookies as she wanted. But today, when she walked outside and scanned the usual line of cars, she saw him. Gabriel Knox, standing next to a sleek black car that looked like something out of a movie. He was in a suit again. Did he always wear suits? Did he sleep in them? Ivy adjusted the straps on her backpack and made her way over, stopping a few feet away. Where's my mom? She's working late, Gabriel said. She asked me to pick you up. Ivy studied him. Are you sure? Something flickered across his face, something unreadable. Yes. She narrowed her eyes. She didn't seem very happy with you yesterday. His jaw tensed slightly. That's between me and your mother. Ivy tilted her head. You don't talk like normal people. Gabriel blinked. What? You sound like a robot. A strange expression crossed his face, like he wasn't sure if he should be offended or amused. Ivy climbed into the car before he could decide. They drove in silence for a few minutes. Gabriel was focused on the road, but Ivy kept sneaking glances at him. The way his hands rested on the steering wheel, the way his jaw clenched every so often, like he was thinking about something too big to say out loud. She pulled her backpack onto her lap, debating. Then, finally, she just said it. Why do you care so much about me? Gabriel's hands tightened on the wheel. For the first time since she had met him, he didn't have an answer. Ivy wasn't snooping. Not really. She had gone into her mom's room to borrow a hair tie. That was all. Her mom always had extras lying around, tangled in the drawer next to the nightstand, mixed in with pens, loose change, and old receipts. But when she pulled the drawer open, something else caught her eye. It was a folder, thick with papers, tucked beneath a stack of envelopes. It wasn't the kind of thing her mom usually kept in random places. Her mom was the everything in its place type. Which made it all the more suspicious. Ivy knew she shouldn't look. But she also knew her mom had been acting weird lately. And Gabriel too. They whispered when they thought she wasn't paying attention. Their conversations stopped the second she walked into the room. And then there was that argument in the kitchen. She hesitated, fingers hovering over the folder. Then she opened it. Her name was at the top of the first page. Her full name, printed in bold letters. Below it, there was a table filled with numbers, percentages, and a pair of names she recognized instantly. Lena Whitmore. Gabriel Knox. She frowned, scanning the words, her brain working too slowly to put the pieces together. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. Her stomach flipped. She knew what a paternity test was. They had learned about DNA in school, the way traits were passed down, how people could use science to prove if someone was related to them. She reread the names, her breath hitching. Gabriel Knox. She wasn't stupid. She shoved the folder back into the drawer and stood there, staring at it, her pulse pounding in her ears. Gabriel wasn't just some guy. And her mom had lied. The apartment door opened, and Ivy turned just as Lena walked in, dropping her bag onto the counter. "Hey, kiddo. What do you want for?" Ivy's voice came out shaky and too loud. "You lied to me." Lena blinked. "What?" Ivy marched out of the bedroom, her heart hammering. "You lied to me." Lena set down her keys. "Ivy, what are you talking about?" Ivy swallowed hard, her hands balling into fists. "I know." Her mother's face changed, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her expression. "Know what?" Ivy took a shaky breath. "Gabriel. He's my dad." Lena went completely still. For a long moment, the room was silent except for the low hum of the fridge. Then Lena closed her eyes, her shoulders rising and falling with a deep breath. When she opened them again, there was no point pretending. "I was going to tell you," she said quietly. "When?" Ivy's voice cracked. "When I turned 18? Lena's expression softened. "Sweetheart." Ivy shook her head. "You let me sit with him. You let me talk to him like he was just some random guy, and the whole time." Lena took a careful step forward. "Ivy, I know this is a lot. You lied." Lena swallowed. "I didn't want to lie to you. I was trying to protect you." Ivy let out a sharp, bitter laugh, and suddenly, she felt hot all over, her face burning, her chest tight. "That's what grown-ups always say." Lena's eyes were sad. "Because it's true." Ivy shook her head and took a step back. "I don't want to talk about this." Lena's expression turned pleading. "Ivy, honey, I know you're upset." Ivy spun on her heel and bolted for the door. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she had to get out. Ivy had never ignored her mother before. Not like this. Lena could handle tantrums. She could handle slammed doors and preteen attitude. But this eerie, suffocating silence, was something else entirely. Ivy came home from school, set her backpack down, and went straight to her room. No hug. No update about her day. No "Hey, Mom, guess what weird thing happened in class today?" Lena tried. She knocked on Ivy's door, left snacks outside, made her favorite dinner. But Ivy barely looked at her. The few times she did speak, her voice was clipped and polite, like Lena was a stranger in her own home. And Gabriel wasn't doing any better. She had told him to give Ivy space, but Gabriel Knox wasn't a man who handled waiting well. "She's a child," he had said, standing in her kitchen, arms crossed. "This isn't how you solve problems." "Oh, really?" Lena had snapped, slamming a cabinet shut. "And what parenting manual did you pull that from?" Gabriel's expression darkened. "You should have told her sooner." Lena let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Oh, should I have? And when exactly was the perfect time, Gabriel?" "When she was 6. When she was still carrying around a stuffed dinosaur everywhere? When she was a toddler learning how to say spaghetti?" Gabriel exhaled slowly, reining himself in. Keeping it from her only made it worse. Lena turned to him, eyes burning. "And what exactly would you have done differently?" Were you going to knock on my door 9 years ago and say, 'Oh hey, I know we've never met, but apparently you're carrying my kid?'" Gabriel's jaw tightened. Lena scoffed. "Yeah. That's what I thought." The days dragged into weeks, and Ivy stayed locked in her world of careful distance. At school, her teachers said she was fine. Normal, even. But Lena knew better. Then, one evening, Lena found Ivy at the kitchen table, picking at a plate of pasta. It wasn't much, but it was something. Lena hesitated. Ivy. I want to see him. Lena's breath caught. Ivy kept her eyes on her plate. Gabriel. Lena swallowed. Are you sure? Ivy nodded once. Yeah. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even close. But it was a start. Gabriel had closed multi-billion-dollar deals in less time than it took to get through an afternoon with Ivy. He had walked into their meeting, playdate? Visitation? What was the correct term for this? With a strategy. He had set up a perfectly curated itinerary, a reservation at a quiet restaurant with a kid-friendly menu, a plan to discuss her education, her interests, what she needed to excel. Ivy had taken one look at him in his usual dark suit and informed him, very plainly, that she was not interested in talking about excelling at anything. Then she had handed him a deck of colorful cards and told him they were playing Uno. Gabriel had no idea what Uno was. He had never played a game that didn't involve stock markets or strategy. His childhood hadn't been filled with board games and movie nights. He had been raised on expectations, on the constant need to perform, to be better. He was not built for this. But Ivy had sat cross-legged on the floor, shuffling the deck with an expertise that suggested she had done this 1,000 times before, and he had realized that he either had to sit down and figure it out or watch her roll her eyes and write him off completely. So he sat. Ivy dealt the cards, her expression already suspicious. You really don't know how to play? Gabriel adjusted his cufflinks, which felt ridiculous considering he was currently perched on a beanbag chair that was far too small for him. No. Wow, Ivy said, shaking her head. That's actually kind of sad. Gabriel exhaled. Just explain the rules. Ivy grinned, like she had just been given an opportunity she hadn't expected. Okay. But I'm not going easy on you. She didn't. He lost. Repeatedly. And it wasn't just losing. It was being defeated. Ivy was ruthless, stacking cards against him in a way that made him question if she was some kind of card shark in her free time. At one point, she hit him with a draw 4 card and let out a maniacal laugh. Gabriel had been humiliated in high-stakes negotiations before, but nothing compared to this. By the 5th round, he was almost enjoying himself. Ivy leaned forward, pointing at his hand. You're holding too many cards. You have to plan ahead. Gabriel raised an eyebrow. That's what I've been doing. No, you've been reacting. You have to think about what I'm going to do. Gabriel paused, studying her. She was 9 years old and somehow teaching him strategy. He played a card, waiting for her reaction. She grinned. Better. But not good enough. He lost again. Later, when they moved to the couch, Ivy pulled up a show on her tablet, something animated and loud, and he assumed she would want to watch alone. Instead, she glanced at him. Do you want to watch? Gabriel hesitated. Is it good? Ivy shrugged. Yeah. Kinda weird, but good. He nodded once. Then put it on. She tilted her head, as if she didn't quite believe him, but then she hit play. Gabriel had never sat through an entire episode of children's television in his life, and it took some effort to stop himself from analyzing the plot holes, the illogical character choices, the absurdity of it all. But Ivy was invested. And when he stopped thinking about how ridiculous it all was, he found himself invested, too. Halfway through the 2nd episode, Ivy glanced at him and smirked. You like it? Gabriel didn't look away from the screen. I didn't say that. You do, she insisted. You're watching. Gabriel exhaled through his nose. It's tolerable. Ivy grinned. That's rich people talk for I like it. He didn't argue. Somewhere in the middle of episode 4, when Ivy was explaining a particularly convoluted plotline with enthusiasm, Gabriel realized he had stopped checking his phone. Stop thinking about work. Stop thinking about everything except the fact that he was sitting next to his daughter, letting her pull him into her world. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just Gabriel Knox, billionaire, CEO, dealmaker. He was just a father. Gabriel had stood in boardrooms packed with executives who would kill to see him fail. He had faced down investors ready to tear his company apart, negotiated deals worth more than some countries' economies. And yet, none of it, had prepared him for the terror of stepping into an elementary school gymnasium decorated with construction paper streamers and the overpowering smell of juice boxes. He adjusted the collar of his shirt, resisting the urge to check his watch. The room was packed with parents and kids, all buzzing with excitement over the annual father-daughter night. The concept had been explained to him at least 3 times, and it still felt like some kind of bizarre endurance test. Ivy, on the other hand, looked completely at ease. She stood beside him, hands in the pockets of her hoodie, glancing around the room like she was evaluating it. He recognized that expression. He had worn that expression in countless board meetings. She glanced up at him. "You look nervous." Gabriel straightened. "I don't get nervous." Ivy smirked. "You totally do." He exhaled slowly, scanning the room again. "This is not my natural environment." Ivy rocked on her heels. "Yeah, no kidding. You're dressed like you're here to buy the school, not attend a pizza party." Gabriel glanced down at his black dress shirt and slacks. He had intentionally gone casual. This was casual, by his standards. Ivy sighed dramatically. "You need, like, jeans. Or a t-shirt." "I own jeans." "I doubt that." Before he could respond, a teacher stepped onto the stage at the front of the gym, tapping the microphone. "Welcome, everyone, to our annual father-daughter night. We're so excited to have you all here. We have games, food, and a special dance at the end of the night." Gabriel felt his stomach tighten. A dance? No one had mentioned a dance. Ivy must have sensed his panic, because she looked up at him and grinned. "You really don't get out much, do you?" Gabriel sighed. "Let's just do the activities." The next hour was nothing short of an ordeal. There were relay races, which he somehow got roped into, despite the fact that he was competing against dads in sneakers and sweatpants while he was dressed like a man who was here to shut the school down for tax reasons. There was an art station where Ivy made him paint, and his attempt at a simple tree had been so appalling that Ivy had snatched the brush from his hand and declared, "Stick to numbers." There was pizza that tasted like cardboard and juice boxes that he could barely hold without feeling ridiculous. And yet, somewhere between Ivy's relentless teasing and the absolute absurdity of it all, Gabriel found himself enjoying it. Not in the way he enjoyed winning. Not in the way he enjoyed control. But in the way that made him realize he had spent years missing this. Ivy was laughing, her shoulders relaxed, her eyes bright. And somehow, in a way he hadn't expected, she felt like his. Then, the music started. Gabriel stiffened as the lights dimmed slightly, kids pulling their dads onto the floor. Ivy turned to him, eyebrows raised. "No," he said immediately. "Yes," she countered. "I don't dance." Ivy grinned. "Then now's a great time to start." Gabriel sighed through his nose, glancing at the crowd of fathers awkwardly swaying while their daughters bossed them around completely. Ivy smirked. "Come on, Mr. Knox. Are you seriously scared of a school gym?" Gabriel gave her a dry look. "You're enjoying this." "Oh, so much." He sighed and extended a hand. "Fine." Ivy took it, pulling him onto the floor, and to his absolute horror, he found himself standing in the middle of an elementary school dance, slow dancing to a song he did not recognize, while his daughter giggled at him the entire time. He let out a breath and muttered, this is ridiculous. Ivy grinned up at him. You're doing great, Dad. Gabriel froze. The word hit him in the chest like a physical thing, knocking the air from his lungs. Ivy didn't seem to notice, still smiling, still swaying slightly in place. But Gabriel couldn't move. She had never called him that before. He swallowed hard, his jaw tightening, his vision blurring slightly in a way that he absolutely refused to acknowledge. Lena stood near the gym entrance, watching. She had spent weeks worrying, weeks convincing herself that no matter how hard Gabriel tried, no matter how much Ivy warmed up to him, there would always be a gap between them that couldn't be crossed. But now, watching Gabriel standing on that dance floor, completely at her daughter's mercy, with a look on his face that she had never seen before, she realized she had been wrong. They had found their own way forward. Gabriel had spent years perfecting efficiency. His entire life had been built around control, numbers, schedules, outcomes. He had never once considered that the greatest challenge of his career wouldn't be an acquisition or a hostile takeover. It would be co-parenting. And it wasn't just about Ivy. It was about Lena, too. She wasn't the kind of person who compromised easily. She was sharp, stubborn, and protective in a way that made it clear that she had been raising Ivy alone for a long time. She knew every detail of their daughter's life, the foods she hated, the books she loved, the way she tapped her fingers on the table when she was thinking. Gabriel was still learning. And Lena was still learning how to let him learn. They didn't always agree. Gabriel thought Ivy should have structure. Lena thought Ivy should have freedom. Gabriel thought private school. Lena thought public. Gabriel wanted to sign Ivy up for extracurriculars that would prepare her for adulthood. Lena wanted Ivy to be a kid. But they had found a rhythm. There were schedules now, ones they had agreed on after weeks of negotiation. Gabriel picked Ivy up from school on Thursdays, took her to dinner, helped her with homework. Weekends were split. They coordinated around Lena's shifts, Gabriel's travel, school events, and doctor's appointments. It wasn't seamless. But it worked. Ivy, for her part, was thriving. She had gone from guarded and uncertain to comfortable and confident, shifting between her two homes with ease. She teased Gabriel relentlessly, poking fun at his wardrobe, his inability to cook, his terrible taste in kid-friendly movies. Gabriel endured it all with the kind of patience he had never shown anyone else. He had stopped checking his phone every time he was with her. Stopped feeling like time away from work was lost time. He knew, without needing to be told, that this was the most important thing he had ever done. Lena saw it, too. One evening, Gabriel stopped by to drop Ivy off, and instead of the usual quick handoff at the door, Lena invited him in. He hesitated, she never invited him in. But Ivy was already pulling him inside, chattering about some ridiculous board game she wanted him to play. Lena leaned against the kitchen counter, watching as Gabriel tried, and failed, to understand the rules. Ivy was in her element, gleefully explaining, shaking her head every time Gabriel got something wrong. It was a messy, imperfect scene. But it was theirs. Lena exhaled, something soft settling in her chest. They weren't together. They weren't traditional. But they were a family. In their own way.